I'm tempted to respond to what Ajay said, but
you should.
Well,
that is why I spoke before.
Perhaps in Q&A. I have stuff written down. I'm going to be robotic. Okay, I'm going to be robotic. I don't know, it's something that has happened to me. I generally believe in spontaneous, besakhta bolna, but perhaps it's a sign of the times that it's not coming these days, and I have to stick to something which I've already written down. So I got a title for what I have to say. It's a very Burkean title. It's called Scattered Reflections on the Trumpian Revolution in Common Sense. So let me begin. Mr. Trump declared a revolution in common sense in his inauguration speech. I want to outline what I think are the strands of common sense which are just the ways he sees the world and which he would like everyone else to accept, hook, line and sinker. Trumpian common sense dictates that we suspend judgment. And Ajay will be familiar with this one. To use a crude joke that we cracked at the free thinkers on campus when we were students, that they had declared freedom from thinking. So essentially, this is what Mr. Trump wants us to do.
So Nirmala Sitharaman was a free thinker.
So you get the message, right? It's all common sense just because Mr. Trump says so. Here are the most important elements of a Trumpian common sense that we must accept, and I will enumerate them one by one. So according to this common sense, if we accept Mr. Trump's common sense, there is no genocide in Gaza that is being committed by the Israelis as we speak right now. If one accepts Donald Trump's common sense, then that means that the Israelis have not been committing genocide in Gaza since the October 7, 2023 Hamas attacks, and that every single report from major human rights organizations can just be overlooked. Trumpian common sense trumps the International Court of Justice's interim ruling that there is a plausibility of genocide being committed in Gaza by Israel, and also the most recent 13th March 2025 UN report of the Commission of Inquiry on Israel's systematic use of sexual, reproductive and other forms of gender-based violence since October 7, 2023. The report looks at how sexual and reproductive healthcare centers have been specifically targeted, including notably Gaza's main in vitro fertility clinic. Now this defies common sense, the way that these attacks are being carried out. And since yesterday, if you've been following this, 300 people have been killed in the renewed attacks on Gaza. Trumpian common sense would like us to believe that what Elon Musk's DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, is doing is just good old-fashioned, no-nonsense, common sense cutting of wasteful governmental expenditure. Trumpian common sense would like us to close our eyes to the reality that Musk's measures are a form of austerity on steroids that has graduated from decades of austerity snips and cuts to government expenditure on public services such as healthcare, public transportation, education, to new wholesale chainsaw slashes of vast swathes of government spending, courtesy Argentina's Javier Milei, who quite conspicuously recently presented Elon Musk with a chainsaw to finish the job. In other words, Trumpian common sense dictates that there is no great chainsaw massacre on government spending on the public provisioning of services. Austerity policies that every major capitalist economy enforces to balance the budget and cut the deficit is just good old-fashioned plain common sense. This common sense turns upside down the fundamental distinction between public finance and personal finance. When governments spend, first they make an estimate of the necessary expenditures to be incurred and then raise revenues accordingly through measures like taxation and public borrowing. Contrary to this, in the case of personal household finance, expenditures based first on an assessment of income. The principles of common sense household and personal finance have been extended to governments to make them prudent and households profligate. On the other hand, households have become increasingly indebted through the rise of credit card debt and housing loans. Thankfully, both of us are scared of it, right? I have a car loan, by the way, which I've got to pay off. The easy extension of credit is one of the neoliberal tricks of the trade to ensure that despite falling real wages, the provision of credit ensures a steady demand for things that people don't really need and which capitalism makes you buy. The economist Paul Sweezy once said that the whole thing about advertising is that it makes you desire things that you don't really need and makes you not want what you actually do need, and that's the whole part of the whole thing of extending credit. Now this is all done to ensure, and I want to stress this point, that the masses remain asses, burdened by debt, never having the ability to question Trumpian common sense. This is the way in which common sense is being enforced upon people. It is just plain common sense that when you give tax breaks to the wealthy, like the Adanis, these wealth creators will do wonderful things for the benefit of society, which will inevitably trickle down for the benefit of all. It is just plain common sense that tax breaks for the rich and trickle-down economic theory work. It is not common sense to see that the kind of tax regimes that have been in place since the advent of neoliberalism, that have enhanced the role of indirect taxes, such as our own very own GST, have resulted in burgeoning inequalities to the extent that inequality has now become socially unsustainable. Common sense dictates that we just overlook inequalities. When it comes to Trumpian common sense, there is no such thing as climate change. And rather than this being the existential threat to humanity, which it may be in the eyes of some of us, the common sense is that terrorism is the biggest threat to humanity. This common sense has been instilled and driven into people's heads since the infamous global war on terror, which it's now 2.5 decades old. In this la-la land of common sense, terrorism is such a big threat that it is okay for people to trade their civil liberties for the sake of security that states promise they will provide. In the past 2.5 decades, since the zealous prosecution of the war on terror, there has been a series of legislative measures that have undermined established basic principles such as habeas corpus. And we are beginning to see the effects of this in the way in which a former student of Columbia University and a green card holder, Mahmoud Khalid, who has broken no law, keep that in mind, broken no law whatsoever, was arrested from his apartment simply because he organized Gaza encampment protests against Israeli military actions. I always like to quote my favorite statistic on terrorism. Mark Twain said, there are lies, there are damned lies, and there are statistics. So here's one statistic for you to digest, which suggests that the likelihood of being killed in a terrorist attack is as low as drowning in a bathtub, the Sridevi effect. Contrasted to this, very low likelihood in the manner in which the idea of terrorism has been so inflated in the imagination that common sense dictates that vast amounts of money on securitization apparatuses and surveillance states can be expended to counter this problem. In terms of this Trumpian common sense, the only terrorist that exists is an Islamic one. It takes the form of the crude aphorism, guess who said this? I'll leave that to your imagination to actually who said this, which this aphorism generously concedes that while all Muslims may not be terrorists, and I'd love to be part of that group, yet all terrorists are certainly Muslims. The world of Trumpian sense has only heard of Al-Qaeda and the ISIS, has never heard of Zionist terrorist groups like the Irgun Zweil Yumi and the Lehi, or Christian terrorist groups such as the Lord's Resistance Army, or groups such as the Badr Meinhof Gang, which is German, the Japanese Red Army, the Tupac Amaru, or the Sendero Luminoso from Latin America. Trumpian common sense has some remarkable ideas on free markets and free speech. In this wonderful wonderland of common sense, free markets are the best guarantors of individual freedom. Now, I also want to point out at this stage how much our liberal friends partake of this particular common sense. You know, all our good old liberal friends. Liberals are good people, right? Good friends of us. Partake of this common sense and how parties of the center-left across the world have accepted the centrality of the market in the way is the only way to seek to win elections. And if you thought it was only political parties of the center-left who were formerly social democratic and had discovered the virtues of the market, I would urge you to think about iconic and respected intellectual figures of the left of center. Left liberals, as they are fashionably called. Take, for instance, the American legal scholar and public intellectual Ronald Dworkin, who in 1981 published a set of influential essays on equality of resources and equality of welfare in the journal Philosophy and Public Affairs. Remarkably, Dworkin, in making the case for equality, puts, these are his words, the market at the center of his theoretical exertions. My point is that in the year 1981, a year into the Reagan presidency, and the global swing of the political pendulum to the right, it cannot be an accident that a left liberal philosopher decides to give an intellectual imprimatur to the idea of the market, making it common sense. What has also become common sense is the idea that the market should sit in judgment over aspects of life that hitherto were not and should never have been subjected to the grand forces of demand and supply. Education, I especially have higher education in mind, has become a realm subjected to market forces. I have been exhorting students to read a 1918 book by the Norwegian-American economist Thorsten Veblen, who over 100 years ago warned that universities should never be run by captains of business and industry. Just look at the state of Columbia University right now, which is basically a real estate enterprise and a hedge fund to which a university has been added perhaps as an afterthought. The manner in which free speech is being slaughtered on university campuses at the behest of the proponents of the free market is a sight that we must collectively bear witness to as it is unfolding right now. In this process, faculty members, especially the tenured, are inadvertently complicit as they have kept their heads down and gone on publishing their papers and books, attending academic conferences and receiving awards. I leave it to your imagination who's getting the awards. Ajay hasn't got any award recently, neither have I.
None.
The only award I got was Best PhD 2007, a long time ago.
I was in that committee.
Friends look after you, right? So, you know, just keep track of who's getting awards these days. Crude common sense, academics, and this includes all of us, have accepted the logic of the academic metric, where the only indicator of academic performance is the fetishization of academic publishing. Crude common sense dictates that people keep silent and go on publishing inanely, insanely, But then there is another common sense that learns from history, especially what the German Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller said when he suggested that there will come a time when there will be no one left to speak for you if you yourself do not speak out when the authorities keep rounding up and dissipating people.
Now we should say there will be no one left to read you.
Perhaps. No? Perhaps we should tell that to our academic friends. And on the question of whether anyone can speak, it would be a good idea certainly for the tenure to finally find their tongues and start using them, finally. Let me come to the Trumpian common sense of free speech, because the common sense of free speech lapses into free speech absolutism, which is something that the far right now swears by unthinkingly. Free speech absolutism is the default common sense of the far right. It is about sitting in the lap of power, Godi media as we call it here in India, Ravish's wonderful term, and yelling at and shouting down at those who speak in a countercurrent against power. The only way to capture the paradox of free speech in Trumpian common sense terms is through my favorite Yiddish word, yutzpah, which for many years I disastrously mispronounced. It is about professing and swearing in the name of free speech while taking every action to clamp down on it. So yutzpah implies that one does exactly what one accuses the other side of doing, which has become a kind of common sense. I urge people to listen to US Vice President J.D. Vance's Munich Security Conference speech in February. Listen to it carefully. And what he has to say on free speech. I also urge people to go back to President Trump's inauguration speech, where again the point about restoring free speech is made. I mean, it's irony. Irony died 1,000 deaths when Mr. Trump is saying, I'm going to restore free speech. Let me make a further point about the free speech common sense of the far right. Any criticism of Israeli military actions is automatically understood as support for Hamas. If you don't believe me, just go to an interview of the man who has become the literal embodiment of free speech, someone who I have previously characterized in an earlier talk by invoking the title of Pico Ayer's book, The Man Within My Head. I'm talking about Salman Rushdie, and what he said about free speech and the Gaza encampments on US university campuses by making light of the question and saying that you cannot support Hamas. I want to suggest that it is well nigh impossible for the thick heads of Trumpian common sense to understand and differentiate between the simple fact that a criticism of the military actions of the state of Israel does not mean lapsing into support for Hamas. How does one drive this simple idea into the minds of the thick-headed who espouse a particular common sense right now? That should be plain common sense, but it is not common sense for Trumpian common sense. Now at this stage, I might start defending a belief in a decent common sense and not a Trumpian common sense. Let me suggest for your consideration my own commonsensical proposition when it comes to the relationship of free speech and free markets. You cannot, and I stress you cannot have free speech when there are completely free markets. For the simple reason that the act of speaking or writing, which is at the center of free speech, is not entirely an act meant to sell. I'm not suggesting that it can't be, but I am suggesting that acts of speaking and writing are not exhausted by the logic of the market. Now this can never enter and be entertained in the world of Trumpian common sense, which looks at the whole world as a strip of real estate. Let me come to Antonio Gramsci. The speaker, Loni, referred to Gramsci. Ajay, you also referred to Gramsci. It's important that we keep in mind what Gramsci has to say in the prison notebooks. Gramsci suggests that common sense or the attitudes and orientations that common people held as eternal truths or verities was a largely fragmentary form of consciousness, and that it condemned them to passivity. He was not entirely dismissive of common sense, as I am now. He didn't romanticize it either, as you suggested correctly. But Gramsci suggested that common sense thinking had a healthy nucleus and good sense, and that this healthy nucleus of good sense could be recovered and brought out more effectively with the critical role that Gramsci assigns to the intellectual. Now, Trumpian common sense has no place whatsoever for any form of intellectualism. So this is where one can begin to see how and why Trumpian common sense is so hopeless. It remains fragmentary, and more important, it is a fragment that now rules in the White House. In response to the title of this event that has been chosen by the organizers, and which I'm treating as a proposition to be spoken for or against, I'm suggesting that common sense should not rule in the way that it is ruling right now. I want to now circle back to the role of the university and the university intellectual in these considerations on common sense. I've always been against academic populism, the idea that what universities do is far too esoteric an enterprise, and that somehow we should dumb down, bring the lowest common denominator of academic discourse down. I'm against that. JNU has often been dismissed as an unreal island. Back in the late 1990s, when I was a student here at JNU, the Indian Express had carried an editorial which suggested that JNU students were getting stupider in direct proportion to the more books that they read. If you don't believe me, go back, I can give you the link to it. The editorial went on to question the very relevance of JNU's social science curriculum for the newly opened up and the new common sense that was emerging in India, liberalization. So I want to remind this younger student audience that back in the 1990s, when people like me and Ajay were young, which is a long, long time ago now, right? We had just started down the road of liberalization and privatization and globalization. It is now time to address where that road has led us. Liberalization, privatization, and globalization has led us to the inequality of the rootless anywhere winners of globalization dividends and the rooted somewhere losers of the globalization game. Trump speaks in the name of the rooted somewhere losers of the globalization game. He speaks the language of the crude common sense that he attributes to them, and in doing so, his populist representation of the people is actually a crude and cruel caricaturing of them. This is a point that I'm borrowing from Hannah Arendt's 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is one of the finest books to read about the 20th century to understand what is going on in the 21st century. With some degree of intellectual and political leadership, a healthy common sense can be molded in the times that we live in. I just want to outline some elements of this healthy, good sense, common sense, the point that Gramsci is making. A healthy, good sense, common sense would encourage skepticism towards and warn against the dangers of trusting the presence of big, powerful, strong men in positions of power. You get who I'm talking about, right? The people with the 56-inch chests and the big hefty men who are all around. Unfortunately, the common sense that has taken hold is that if you put the right kind of unvarnished, plain-speaking and loud-talking men, in some cases women as well, Giorgia Meloni, the problems of earning a living and the cost of living will all be taken care of. A healthy common sense should be able to act like a fascist detector of dictatorship. That should be common sense. You can see fascism wherever it is arising. Unfortunately, the kind of common sense that we're talking about does not allow for that kind of discernment to happen. I have been amazed by political scientists who are still thinking of these times as somehow normal and routine times. In a conversation that I had with an American political scientist after the Trump victory and before his inauguration, I was perturbed by the fact that he was still thinking in terms of midterm pushback and checks and balances. I told him that I see no checks and balances, and the term that I used was to expect the unexpected. The fluid uncertainty of the times that we are living in is such that we cannot even begin to think of what the next 5 days will look like, let alone the next 5 months or the next 5 years. We are navigating uncharted waters, and as far as I'm concerned, and my common sense informs me, the only landmarks that we have landmarks of the past that we have as a struggle to forge a future is the 1930s all over again. Sadly, the longevity of memories when it comes to common sense is pretty short, and we must learn from the lessons of history. Finally, one of the biggest tragedies of common sense is to miss the wood for the trees. And I see this especially in academia, in particular the discipline that I teach, political theory. Academia is woefully and stupidly lost in its forested footnotes, ensnared, entrapped, and mired in minutiae. I am not for a minute suggesting that details should not be entertained and considered by academics, but I am urging as a matter of concern and with some sense of urgency that the tragedy of missing the bigger picture should not happen. There is a need to understand a wider sweep and movement of history that is not preordained from heaven and which we somehow need to discern. On the contrary, common sense demands that we realize and understand that we are in the throes of witnessing the demise of an old order and the very painful birth of a new one, the interregnum that you talked about, quoting Gramsci. Common sense demands that we collectively act as the midwives to the birth of this new world order that can configure what is left of the 21st century so that we can go on living what is left of our lives in a manner that is just and equal and peaceful. The invocation of common sense is simply the excuse that a fascist ruler uses to mobilize the mob against the decency and the healthy common sense that must prevail over society but never rule over it. Finally, the only thing that I can say about this particular notion of common sense that is being upheld by people like Trump is that this is an offense to the senses. It's an offense to intelligence. I can only end by quoting Habib Jalib, the famous Pakistani poet, who said, "Is zehn ke loot ko, is khule jhoot ko, main nahi manta, main nahi janta." Thank you so much. Q&A, all right? Q&A.
Get me a black coffee.
No, I don't. He doesn't take.